The story of D-Day, June 6, 1944, begins not with the rising sun, but in the dead of night. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of Allied aircraft rumble across the English Channel. On board, men from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne, the British 6th Airborne, and Canadian paratroopers prepare for a leap of faith. Their mission is a surgical strike from the sky. They must seize vital bridges, block roads, and silence the German guns that threaten the main invasion force, set to land at dawn. Just 16 minutes past midnight, the first decisive action unfolds. British glider troops execute a textbook landing, coming to a halt just meters from their targets. The Caen Canal and Orne River bridges. These bridges, later made famous as Pegasus Bridge, are captured in a swift, audacious assault. This single act secures the entire eastern flank of the invasion, preventing German armor from sweeping in and crushing the landings on Sword Beach. It's a flawless start to an operation where anything could go wrong. Meanwhile, on the western flank, the American paratroopers face a different kind of chaos. High winds and anti-aircraft fire scatter them across the flooded marshlands of the Cotentin Peninsula, many land miles from their designated drop zones, alone or in small, isolated groups. The meticulously planned operation seems to unravel before it even begins. Yet, this very chaos becomes an unexpected weapon. As these scattered soldiers emerge from the darkness all over the countryside, they sow confusion and panic among the German defenders. Reports flood German command centers of enemy troops appearing everywhere at once, making it impossible to mount a coordinated counterattack against the real threat building at Utah Beach. These small, impromptu bands of brothers disrupt communication lines, ambush German patrols, and fight with incredible bravery, turning a disastrous drop into a strategic advantage. As the sky begins to lighten, just before 6 in the morning, the sea itself erupts. The largest naval bombardment in human history opens up on the Normandy coast. A massive fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashes a terrifying storm of steel and fire against the German fortifications of the Atlantic Wall. For nearly an hour, the coastline is pounded relentlessly, the explosions shaking the very ground, meant to shatter concrete bunkers, shred barbed wire, and demoralize the defenders. From Sainte-Marie-du-Mont in the west to Ouistreham in the east, the German positions are hammered, a prelude to the infantry assault to come. Then, through the smoke and haze, the landing craft appear, racing toward the 5 designated beaches. The first landings at Utah Beach are a stroke of incredible luck. Strong currents push the landing craft of the American 4th Infantry Division nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended target. This navigational error turns out to be a blessing. They come ashore on a section of the beach with far lighter German defenses than the one they were supposed to hit. The casualties are comparatively light, and the troops, led by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the oldest man in the first wave, quickly push off the beach and begin moving inland to link up with the airborne troops. Utah is a success, a crucial first step in securing the peninsula. But just a few miles east, at a beach codenamed Omaha, the story is tragically different. Here, the plan falls apart with devastating consequences. The pre-landing bombardment was ineffective, leaving the formidable German defenses of the veteran 352nd Infantry Division almost untouched as the ramps of the landing craft drop. The American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions are met with a murderous hail of machine gun, mortars, and artillery fire. The first wave is decimated. Men are cut down in the water, on the wet sand, and at the heavily mined beach shingle. The beach becomes a killing field, littered with the dead and wounded. For hours, the assault stalls, the survivors pinned down, seeking any cover they can find. It seems the invasion here is on the brink of complete failure. Yet, amidst the horror, leaders emerge. Small groups of soldiers, driven by sheer grit and courage, begin to make a difference. Captains, lieutenants, and sergeants rally the terrified men around them. They realize that staying on the beach means certain death. The only way out is up the steep bluffs, through the minefields and barbed wire, and into the German trenches. Groups of soldiers start blowing gaps in the wire, using Bangalore torpedoes. They crawl, climb, and fight their way up the draws and bluffs, engaging the German defenders in close-quarters combat. It's a brutal, inch-by-inch fight, fueled by desperation and an unbreakable will to survive. Slowly, painstakingly, these small breakthroughs begin to create a foothold. Omaha Beach, which almost became a disaster, is ultimately taken not by grand strategy, but by the raw courage of individual soldiers who refused to give up. Further east, the British and Canadian forces land at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. They, too, face stiff resistance. At Gold Beach, British troops fight their way through heavily fortified coastal villages, battling house to house. At Juno, the Canadians face some of the toughest defenses outside of Omaha. The initial naval bombardment missed many key gun emplacements, and the first wave of Canadian infantry suffers heavy losses, but they press on with fierce determination, pushing through the chaos on the beach and advancing further inland on D-Day than any other Allied unit, capturing the town of Courcelles on Sword Beach. The British troops land and quickly fight their way towards their primary objective, the city of Caen. They link up with the paratroopers at Pegasus Bridge, solidifying the eastern flank. While they are stopped short of capturing Caen on the first day, their advance puts immense pressure on the German defenders. As the sun sets on June 6, 1944, the longest day comes to a close. Not all objectives have been met. The city of Caen remains in German hands, and the beachheads are not yet fully linked into one continuous front. The foothold is precarious, vulnerable, but it is a foothold nonetheless. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers are ashore in Normandy. They have breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The cost has been immense, with thousands killed, wounded, or missing. But the Allies are on the continent to stay. The toehold gained on this single bloody day will grow into a torrent that will sweep across France and ultimately lead to the liberation of Europe. The beginning of the end for Nazi Germany had begun on the sands of Normandy. The cheering and relief of a successful D-Day landing quickly faded. The days that followed June 6, 1944, plunged the Allied soldiers into a brutal, unforgiving reality that nobody had truly anticipated. Welcome to the hedgerow hell. The Allied planners had envisioned a swift breakout from the Normandy beaches, a rapid push inland, but the landscape itself had other plans. Normandy wasn't open fields. It was a labyrinth of ancient hedgerows, or bocage, as the French call it. These weren't your garden variety hedges. They were massive, centuries-old earthen walls, often several feet thick and over 10 feet high, topped with a dense, tangled mess of trees, shrubs, and thorns. Every single field was a self-contained fortress, a natural killing box. For the German defenders, this was a dream come true. For the attacking American, British, and Canadian soldiers, it was a waking nightmare. Imagine you're a young GI. Your platoon has to cross a single field. On the other side, hidden in the thick is a German machine gun team from the battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division, the same one that bloodied the Americans on Omaha Beach. They're dug in, they're concealed, and they have perfect fields of fire. Your tanks can't just crash through these earthen walls. They get stuck, exposing their thin underbelly armor to German anti-tank weapons like the Panzer. Your infantry squads have to crawl, inch by inch, under a hail of machine gun fire and mortar, trying to find a weak spot. Every hedge-lined road becomes an ambush alley. Every field becomes a separate, vicious battle. This was the brutal reality of the bocage. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards, often at a terrible cost. While the Americans were getting bogged down in this gritty, close-quarters fight in the west, the British and Canadian forces to the east faced an equally daunting task: the capture of Caen. This historic city was a primary objective for D-Day itself, expected to be in Allied hands by nightfall on June 6th. Instead, it became a symbol of stubborn German resistance and a meat grinder for the British Second Army. Why was Caen so important? It was a vital road and rail hub. Controlling it meant controlling the gateway to the open plains of France. Perfect country for the Allies' armored divisions to finally break loose. The Germans knew this just as well. They committed their most powerful units to its defense, including elite panzer divisions like the 21st and the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division, The British and Canadians launched a series of major offensives to take the city. Operations like Perch and Epsom were massive, brutal affairs. Picture waves of infantry advancing across open ground towards heavily fortified villages and ridges, all under the watchful eye of German 88mm guns, arguably the most feared anti-tank gun of the war. German panzer counterattacks were swift and savage. The fields around Caen became a graveyard of burnt-out tanks from both sides. The fighting was relentless, a constant cycle of attack and counterattack. The city of Caen itself was systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, intended to break the defenders' will but also turning the streets into a maze of rubble that actually aided the German defense. The battle for Caen dragged on for weeks, becoming a bloody stalemate. But this brutal fight had a hidden, strategic benefit by drawing in and pinning down the bulk of Germany's elite armored reserves. The British and Canadians were preventing them from moving west to crush the American beachhead. They were absorbing the heaviest blows, setting the stage for a decisive American breakout later on. Meanwhile, on the Cotentin Peninsula, the Americans had a different critical objective. The port of Cherbourg. The Allies were pouring men and supplies onto the beaches, but the temporary mulberry harbors were vulnerable to weather and could unhandle the sheer volume of material needed to sustain a continental invasion. They needed a deep-water port, and Cherbourg was the prize. The 7th Corps, under General J. Lawton Collins, turned north and began the grueling fight up the peninsula. Just like in the bocage further south, the terrain was difficult, and the German defenders fought for every inch of ground. Progress was slow, marked by vicious firefights for key hills and crossroads. The fighting was bitter and personal, but the Americans pushed relentlessly forward. Bilate June, they had surrounded Cherbourg and began their final assault. The city's German commander had been ordered by Hitler to defend it to the last man, turning the port into a fortress. The Americans had to fight their way through a ring of formidable forts, blasting their way into concrete bunkers and engaging in brutal combat in the city streets. On June 26th, after a final, ferocious battle, the German garrison surrendered. The capture of Cherbourg was a massive victory. When the Allies entered the port, however, they found that the Germans had been masters of demolition. The harbor was a wrecked mine, blocked with sunken ships, and its crucial cranes and docks systematically destroyed. It would take weeks of intensive work by engineers to get it operational again. But despite the sabotage, the fall of Cherbourg was a huge psychological and logistical win. The Allies now had their major port. So, let's take stock. By the end of June 1944, the situation looked like a paradox. The Allies had achieved a monumental feat of logistics. Over 1 million soldiers, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies had been successfully landed in Normandy. The beachhead was secure. Cherbourg was captured. The German army in the west was taking unsustainable losses. Yet, a glance at the map was disheartening. The front line had barely moved. The Allies were still bottled up in a small pocket of Normandy, just a few miles inland from the D-Day beaches. The bocage in the defense of Caen had turned the campaign into a slogging match, a war of grinding attrition. The Allied High Command was growing frustrated. The press and the public back home were getting anxious. The swift breakout they had promised had not happened, but the seeds of victory were being sown in the blood and mud of the hedgerows. The German army was being bled white, its panzer divisions worn down, and its infantry exhausted. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic and decisive operations of the entire war. The breakout was coming. 4 weeks after D-Day, the fighting in Normandy had been a bloody stalemate. The hedgerows, ancient earthen banks, topped with thick bushes, turned the landscape into a fortress. Every field was a separate battle, a meat grinder for infantry and tanks. The Germans, masters of defense, had dug in deep. The Allies were inching forward, paying for every yard with heavy casualties. Morale was starting to fray under the constant strain of combat and the seemingly endless, claustrophobic hedgerow fighting. The big question hanging over the Allied High Command was, how do we break out of this? Throughout early July, the pressure was relentless, especially on the eastern flank of the beachhead. British and Canadian forces were locked in a vicious struggle for the city of Caen. This wasn't just about capturing a city. It was a strategic battle of attrition. The Germans considered Caen the pivot of their entire defensive line. If it fell, the door to Paris would swing open. Because of this, they threw their best units, their elite panzer divisions, into the fight around Caen. This led to a series of costly British and Canadian offensives. Operations like Charnwood and Jupiter made slow, grinding progress. Then came Operation Goodwood on July 18th. This was a massive armored assault, the largest of the campaign, launched by the British Second Army. Thousands of tanks rolled forward under a canopy of air support, aiming to smash through the German lines east of Caen once and for all. The initial assault was impressive, but the Germans had prepared deep and layered defenses. Anti-tank guns were everywhere, hidden in villages and woods. The open terrain that seemed perfect for a tank charge soon became a killing ground. British tank losses were heavy, and the operation sparked considerable controversy. Was it a failure? Tactically, it didn't achieve the dramatic breakthrough that some had hoped for, but strategically, Goodwood was a resounding success, and this is key to understanding what happened next. The relentless attacks on Caen, culminating in Goodwood, forced the Germans to commit the bulk of their armored strength, their mobile reserves, to the British sector. Field Marshal Bonclou, the German commander, was convinced the main Allied breakout attempt would come from the Caen area. He had no choice but to keep his panzers there. This fixed them in place. They were stuck, unable to move west to counter the threat that was brewing in the American sector. General Montgomery's strategy had worked. He had drawn the German armor onto his forces, like a matador drawing a bull, setting the stage for his American counterpart, General Omar Bradley, to deliver the final blow. With the German panzer divisions tied up in the east, a window of opportunity opened for the Americans in the west. This was the moment General Bradley had been waiting for. His plan had a code name that would go down in history: Operation Cobra. Cobra wasn't just another attack. It was designed to be the decisive punch that would shatter the German front line and unleash the full might of the American army into the French countryside. The plan was audacious. It relied on overwhelming air power to blast a hole in the German defenses. The target was a narrow, rectangular corridor of land just west of the town of Saint-Lay. This area was held by a depleted but still determined German unit, the Panzer Lehr Division. Bradley's concept was simple: use thousands of bombers to carpet bomb this corridor, obliterating everything in it. Then, American infantry would pour through the gap, clear the way, and armored divisions would follow, racing deep into the German rear. The date was set for July 24th. But Normandy's weather, which had plagued the Allies since D-Day, intervened again. Poor visibility forced a last-minute postponement after some bombers were already in the air. The next day, July 25th, the skies cleared. The signal was given. Operation Cobra was a go. What happened next was one of the most terrifying and awesome displays of air power in military history. The sky over Normandy literally darkened. More than 1,500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force, followed by hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers, flew over the target zone. For hours, they dropped tens of thousands of bombs onto the narrow strip of land. The effect on the ground was apocalyptic. The earth shook as if from a continuous earthquake. Entire sections of the landscape were vaporized, leaving a moonscape of craters. Trees, hedgerows, trenches, and German soldiers simply disappeared. The noise was indescribable, a deafening, rolling thunder that drove men mad. The German Panzer Lehr Division, directly in the path of the bombing, was effectively annihilated. Survivors were left dazed, shell-shocked, and completely unable to fight. One German officer described it as being bombed into insanity. However, the immense power of the air attack came with a terrible cost. In what became known as a short drop incident, some bombs fell on the American front lines. The dust and smoke from the initial waves obscured the targets for later bombers, causing them to release their payloads too early. American soldiers from the 30th and 9th Infantry Divisions were caught in their own army's bombardment. Hundreds were killed or wounded. Among the dead was one of the highest-ranking American officers to be killed in action in the war, Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, who was there as an observer. It was a tragic start to the operation. Despite the tragedy of friendly fire, the bombing had done its job. It had punched a massive, gaping hole in the German front. The breach had been made immediately following the bombardment. American infantry divisions surged forward into the smoking, cratered landscape. They advanced through the stunned and shattered remnants of the German defenses, encountering pockets of resistance but nothing that could stop the momentum. The first phase of Cobra was a success. Now it was time for the exploitation phase. The next day, July 26th, the armored divisions were unleashed. This is when the character of the Normandy campaign changed completely. The static, grinding warfare of the hedgerows was over. It was replaced by a war of movement, of lightning speed and rapid advances. U.S. armored columns, led by generals like the aggressive George S. Patton, whose Third Army was now activated, poured through the gap. They didn't just push the German line back, they shattered it. Instead of fighting for fields, they were now capturing towns and cities. They fanned out, one column heading west toward the Brittany Peninsula, another hooking south and east to encircle the remaining German forces in Normandy. The German command was thrown into total confusion. Their front line no longer existed. Communications were cut. Units were isolated and destroyed. The German 7th Army was facing complete collapse. The speed of the American advance was stunning. On July 30th, just 5 days after Cobra began, American spearheads captured the critical crossroads town of Évranchez at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. This was the gateway to Brittany and the rest of France. The breakout was complete. The German front in Normandy was no longer bending. It was breaking apart. The relentless pressure from the British and Canadians around Caen had held the German armor in place, while the overwhelming power of Operation Cobra had delivered the knockout blow. The stalemate was over. The War of Liberation had entered a new, dynamic phase. The race across France had begun. Welcome back to our series on the Battle of Normandy. We've reached the final, dramatic chapter. The encirclement, the collapse, and the liberation of Paris. The date is July 26, 1944. Operation Cobra has just shattered the German defenses in the west, and the Allies are poised to deliver the knockout blow. What follows is one of the most decisive and devastating encirclements of World War II. The Allied plan was audacious. After the American breakout, General Bradley saw a golden opportunity. Instead of just pushing east, he ordered his forces, led by General Patton's Third Army, to swing south and then hook sharply east, aiming for the town of Arges. Simultaneously, the British and Canadian forces, having finally broken through south of Caen, were ordered to drive hard towards the town of Falaise. If these two pincers could meet, they would trap the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a deadly embrace. But there was a problem. Hitler, the German high command on the ground, saw the impending disaster. Field Marshal von Kluge, the commander in the west, pleaded for permission to withdraw his armies behind the Seine River to establish a new defensive line. He knew his forces were on the brink of annihilation, but in his remote headquarters, Hitler saw things differently. Obsessed with holding ground and blind to the reality of the situation, he refused. Not only did he forbid a retreat, he ordered a counter. He demanded that von Kluge gather his remaining panzer divisions and strike west at Mortagne to cut off Patton as spearheads. It was a move born of fantasy, a desperate gamble with forces that barely existed anymore. The German generals knew it was suicide. The panzer divisions were exhausted, depleted, and critically short on fuel. The skies were owned by Allied fighter bombers, ready to pounce on any German movement. But an order was an order. The attack at Mortagne was launched on August 7th. It was a disaster from the start. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division, nicknamed Old Hickory, put up a heroic defense, holding their ground against repeated panzer assaults. From the air, Allied Typhoons and Thunderbolts rained down rockets and bombs, turning the German armored columns into funeral pyres. The counterattack faltered and then collapsed, and in doing so, it sealed the fate of the German army in Normandy. By throwing his last reserves into this futile attack, Hitler had pushed them even deeper into the Allied trap. Now the Allied pincers began to close with terrifying speed. The Americans reached Argentan, while the Canadians and the newly activated Polish 1st Armored Division fought their way south towards Falaise. the gap between them narrowed by the hour. Inside this developing pocket, chaos reigned. Over 100,000 German soldiers, along with their tanks, artillery, and transport, were crammed into a shrinking area, under constant, merciless bombardment from the air and from artillery. The roads were clogged with burning vehicles and panicked troops. By August 12th, the situation was critical. Field Marshal von Kluff, realizing the battle was lost and fearing Hitler's wrath, finally gave the order to retreat, defying the Führer. But it was too late. The gap between Falaise and Argenton was now only a few miles wide, and it was a corridor of death. The Poles held a key position on a ridge known as Mont Ormel, or the Mice, from which they could direct fire down onto the fleeing Germans. They fought with incredible bravery against desperate German attempts to break out, including attacks by remnants of elite SS Panzer divisions. What happened inside the Falaise Pocket between August 12th and 21st is almost indescribable. Survivors and witnesses described it as an apocalypse. General Eisenhower later called it one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas. The fields and roads were a hellscape of twisted metal, burning tanks, dead horses, and the bodies of thousands of soldiers. The stench of death hung over the landscape for weeks. Allied pilots reported they could smell the battlefield from thousands of feet in the air. It was the complete and utter destruction of an army. Although an estimated 20 to 40,000 German troops managed to escape through the gap before it was fully sealed on August 21st, their losses were catastrophic. Around 10,000 were killed, and 50,000 were taken prisoner. They left behind almost all of their heavy equipment tanks, artillery, and vehicles. The German 7th Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The defensive front in the west had not just been broken, it had been vaporized. With the German army in Normandy shattered, the path of Paris was wide open. The Allied advance turned into a race across France. And in Paris itself, something incredible was happening. On August 19th, inspired by the news of the Allied approach, the French resistance rose in open revolt against the German garrison. Barricades went up in the streets, just as they had in revolutions past. The city's police force joined the uprising, and fighting broke out across the capital. The German commander in Paris, General von Choltitz, had received direct orders from Hitler to destroy the city if he could not hold it, to blow up its bridges, landmarks, and monuments, and leave the Allies a smoking ruin. But Choltitz, seeing the futility of the German cause and unwilling to go down in history as the man who destroyed Paris, hesitated. Meanwhile, Allied command was initially hesitant to divert forces to Paris, wanting to bypass it and continue the pursuit of the retreating Germans. But General de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, insisted. For the honor of France, Paris had to be liberated by French soldiers. Eisenhower agreed. He dispatched the French 2nd Armored Division, under General Philippe Leclerc, supported by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. On the evening of August 24th, advance elements of Leclerc's division slipped into the city, reaching the Hôtel de Ville, T-City. Pole. The next morning, on August 25th, the main forces entered Paris to the rapturous joy of its citizens. Crowds poured into the streets, cheering, waving flags, and showering the soldiers with flowers and kisses. The German garrison formally surrendered. After 4 long years of occupation, Paris was free. The Battle of Normandy was over. It had lasted 80 days. The cost was immense. The Allies suffered over 226,000 casualties. The Germans lost an estimated 200,000 killed and wounded, with another 200,000 taken prisoner. The beautiful region of Normandy was devastated, and tragically, over 20,000 French civilians lost their lives in the crossfire. But the outcome was decisive and strategically vital. The Allies had secured an unbreakable foothold in Western Europe. They had destroyed the bulk of the German army in the west and opened a clear road to the German border and the Rhine River. The liberation of Paris was a massive symbolic and morale victory that echoed around the world. The beginning of the end for the Third Reich had truly begun, forged in the hedgerows, fields, and towns of Normandy.